At 34 years old, Odessa Calloway stood on a courthouse porch in the Montana Territory with $14 sewn into her hem and nowhere left to sleep. Her husband's brother, Warwick Calloway, had signed papers behind her back and called the family smithy his own, and the sheriff had nodded along because Warwick poured the whiskey at every town meeting that mattered. She had a trunk, a coat too thin for October, and those $14. So when the auctioneer's gavel came down on a collapsed, rat-chewed livery stable at the edge of Larkspur Hollow, and the bidding stalled at $10 because no one else wanted a roof that leaked and a name nobody remembered, Odessa raised her hand before she'd finished thinking it through. Folks laughed. A woman alone, buying a barn full of pigeon droppings and broken stalls, was the kind of foolishness men liked to repeat over supper. What none of them knew, what even Odessa didn't know yet, was that sealed above the rafters of that dying building sat a secret old enough to rewrite who truly owned the ground Larkspur Hollow stood on. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Odessa Calloway. If you've ever been counted out before anyone gave you a real chance, you'll know this feeling. Consider subscribing to keep these stories coming and tell us where you're watching from. Here's where it began. Odessa had not always been a woman with $14 to her name. She had grown up 40 miles east, in a settlement called Cotter's Bend, the daughter of a blacksmith named Elias Rourke, who believed a person's worth showed itself in what they built, not what they inherited. He taught her the forge before he taught her to read, and she took to it the way some children take to music, the ring of hammer on iron, the particular orange of metal at the edge of workable heat, the patience required to let a thing become what it was meant to be, instead of forcing it. Fire doesn't rush, he used to tell her. It only ruins what you rush it into. She married young, to a quiet, careful man named Samuel Calloway, and the two of them ran a smithy together in Larkspur Hollow for 9 years. Samuel on the books and the customers, Odessa on the anvil, though most of the town pretended not to notice whose hands had actually shaped their plow blades and wagon axles. She learned in those years to read people the way her father had taught her to read metal, watching for the hairline crack before it became a break. She learned patience. She learned to keep her own counsel and let her work answer for her. There was a particular Sunday, early in her marriage, when a farmer named Reuben Hayes came in, complaining that a competing smith, 2 towns over, had offered to fix his plow blade for half what the Calloways charged. Samuel had wanted to match the price out of worry, but Odessa had simply asked to see the blade, turned it once in her hands, and told him plainly that the other man's repair would snap inside a season because he'd rushed the temper on the steel. She was right. Reuben Hayes came back that autumn, blade in hand, exactly as she'd said, and never once doubted her word again. It was a small thing, but it taught her something she carried the rest of her life, that being right quietly and being patient about it mattered more in the end than being loud. Samuel used to tease that she trusted iron more than people, and she never fully argued the point, because iron, at least, told you the truth about itself if you knew how to listen. She did not yet know how much she would need both of those lessons, and soon. Samuel died of a fever in the spring, sudden and unfair the way fevers are, and grief had barely settled into Odessa's chest before Warwick arrived with a lawyer and a stack of paper. He was Samuel's younger brother, a man who had spent most of his adult life borrowing money he called investments and charm he called business sense. He produced a debt Odessa had never seen documented in 9 years of keeping the ledgers herself, a debt supposedly owed against the smithy, and a signature at the bottom that looked like Samuel's only if you didn't look too closely, and nobody in Larkspur Hollow was inclined to look too closely at anything Warwick Calloway put in front of them, because Warwick had a way of remembering favors owed and calling them in publicly. The judge, a friend of Warwick's from the territorial capital, ruled the smithy forfeit within a season. Odessa was given 3 days to clear her things. She left with a trunk of tools too worn to interest the new owner, a coat, and the $14 she'd hidden inside her mattress since the week Samuel died, some instinct in her already suspecting she might need money nobody else knew existed. She did not cry in front of Warwick. She promised herself that on the porch of her own home, watching men she'd fed at her table carry out her husband's ledgers like spoils, and she kept that promise. But something in her hardened that week into a kind of quiet, deliberate patience, the same patience her father had taught her at the forge. She would not rush, she would watch for the crack. The weeks after were the hardest of her life. She took a room above the mercantile, paid for by mending harnesses and sharpening tools for anyone willing to hire a woman for work most men assumed she couldn't do. Some were kind about it, more were not. A few doors closed on her outright, out of fear of crossing Warwick, and she learned quickly which of her husband's old customers had only ever respected Samuel's name and never truly her hands. She kept her chin level through all of it. She stopped attending church for a season, tired of the sideways glances and the whispered theories about what she must have done to lose her own home, and instead spent her Sundays walking the edges of town, watching the buildings nobody wanted, the way her father used to walk a scrapyard, looking for iron with good bones still left in it. And 3 weeks after she'd been put out, standing at the edge of a courthouse auction, with nothing left to lose, she found it, wedged into a listing nobody wanted, the old Ferris livery, foreclosed and forgotten, sold as is, for whatever anyone would pay. The building had belonged to a man named Tobias Ferris, who had run it for nearly 30 years before he died with no children and, it seemed, no heirs interested enough to claim it. The roof sagged over the east stalls. Pigeons had colonized the loft. The whole structure smelled of old hay gone to rot and years of rain finding its way through gaps nobody had patched. When the auctioneer called for bids and got silence, then a scattering of laughter, Odessa raised her hand and said $10 in a voice that did not shake, though her heart was doing something close to it. Nobody bid against her. The gavel fell. A man behind her muttered that a fool and her money were soon parted, loud enough for her to hear, and she did not turn around. She had learned that lesson too, at the forge. You don't answer every strike with a strike. Sometimes you let the sound pass through you and keep working. She spent her first week clearing the ground floor, sweeping out 3 decades of dust with a borrowed broom, patching the worst of the roof with scrap tin she bartered for, using the last of her father's tools. It was honest, punishing work, and she did it alone, because she had no one left in Larkspur Hollow willing to be seen helping her, not with Warwick's temper being what it was. It was on the 6th day, moving a rotted ladder to reach a leak near the loft, that her hand found a seam in the ceiling boards that didn't match the rest, a square panel, fitted too carefully to be accidental, with a brass ring recessed flush into the wood. Her breath caught. She pried at it with a flat iron bar until the panel gave, dust sifting down into her hair and her open collar, and above it she found not more rot, not more pigeon nests, but a small, dry, deliberately sealed attic space, built, she would later understand, by Tobias Ferris's own hands, tucked between the roofline and the loft ceiling, where no casual inspection would ever find it. Inside sat a single trunk, iron-banded, its lock long rusted shut, and beside it a tin box wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the damp out for 30 years. Her hand stopped on the latch. She didn't breathe, not yet. Dust hung in the lamplight around her, like something suspended in water, and somewhere below a horse, she'd taken in that week shifted in its stall, the only sound in a building that suddenly felt far larger than four walls and a collapsed roof. She worked the rusted lock loose with a chisel from her father's toolkit, and when the trunk finally opened, what greeted her was not treasure in the way the word usually means. It was paper, ledgers, deeds, a bundle of letters tied with cord gone brittle, and a hand-drawn survey map of the land Larkspur Hollow itself sat on, dated 11 years before the town's official founding charter. She sat on the dusty floorboards and read by lamplight until well past midnight, and what she found made the hair rise on her arms. The ledgers belonged to Tobias Ferris, but the deeper documents beneath them told an older story. Before Larkspur Hollow was Larkspur Hollow, the valley had been legally settled and worked by a community of freed families, among them a man named Isaiah Freeman, a former cavalryman who had claimed and registered the land under the Homestead Act, built the first well, the first schoolhouse, the first proper road down to the river. The survey map bore his name in careful ink. And tucked in with the letters was a second document, its language sparse and businesslike and devastating, a record showing that the land had been quietly reassigned through the Territorial Land Office to a syndicate headed by one Odessa Calloway, Warwick's own grandfather, through a filing that misrepresented Isaiah Freeman's claim as abandoned when it had never been abandoned at all. Tobias Ferris, it seemed, had been the young clerk who processed the paperwork, had realized decades too late what he'd been party to, and had spent the rest of his life hoarding the proof instead of the money he might have made burying it. In one letter, written in a shaking hand near the end of his life, he'd written that he was leaving the truth for whoever was patient enough to find it, because he no longer trusted himself to set it right, and hoped someone braver would. What looks like a warped roof and a rusted lock is not always what it seems to be. Sometimes the thing holding a structure together isn't visible from the street at all. A house doesn't fail because the paint peels. It fails when the foundation goes unattended, quietly, for years, while everyone above admires the porch. Larkspur Hollow had been standing on borrowed ground for 2 generations, and not one soul walking its main street knew the walls they trusted were built on someone else's floor. What looked worthless to a town in a hurry, an abandoned barn, a dead man's forgotten trunk, was, to the one person willing to climb into the dark and look, the very thing holding the whole structure of the town's history up. Odessa did not sleep that night. By morning, she understood 2 things clearly. The documents in her hands could restore the Freeman family's rightful claim to land that had built half the fortunes in Larkspur Hollow, including Warwick's own house and his standing at every town meeting he'd ever poured whiskey at, and that revealing this would put her directly in the path of a man who had already shown he'd bend a judge to take what he wanted. She was careful. She spent 2 weeks quietly asking after the Freeman family, learning from an old freighter who remembered the name that Isaiah Freeman's granddaughter, a widow named Clara Freeman Boyd, still lived 2 counties over, working a rented plot far smaller than the one her grandfather had built with his own hands. Odessa wrote to her, cautiously, without revealing everything, and in the meantime, word had already begun to travel that the fool who'd bought Ferris's old livery for $10 had found something up in that loft. Warwick came to see her himself, on a grey afternoon, all civility on the surface and threat underneath, the way he always was. "I hear you've been digging through a dead man's junk," he said, standing in her half-repaired doorway like he still owned every doorway in town. "I have," Odessa said. "Whatever you found up there," he said, "it isn't yours. This is Calloway land, same as it's been for 40 years. 40 years, Odessa said quietly, is a strange number for you to be so sure of. She watched something flicker behind his eyes, not confusion, but recognition, and understood that he already knew, or suspected, exactly what she'd found. In the weeks that followed, he tried what men like Warwick always try. He spread word through the saloon that Odessa Calloway had gone strange since her husband died, hoarding a dead man's papers and telling wild stories. He leaned on the one lawyer in town who might have helped her, reminding him of debts owed. He even sent 2 men to inspect the livery for structural safety, men who spent more time looking in the loft than checking the beams. Odessa had already moved the trunk, wrapped in an old horse blanket and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the room above the mercantile, and she said nothing when the 2 men climbed back down empty-handed and reported to Warwick that they'd found nothing but pigeon nests. She did not celebrate that small victory either. She had learned from her father that the moment you let a win show on your face, you hand the next round to whoever is watching you closest, and Warwick was always watching. He tried a gentler approach next, arriving one evening with an offer to buy the livery outright, 20 times what she'd paid, framed as a kindness to a grieving widow who'd gotten in over her head. She thanked him and refused, and watched the kindness curdle into something colder behind his eyes before he left. She had learned patience from a forge fire, and she used it now, letting Warwick's temper do the work of proving himself to anyone still watching closely, while she quietly gathered sworn statements from the old freighter and 2 other long-time residents who remembered Isaiah Freeman's well, his schoolhouse, the road he'd cut down to the river with his own 2 hands before the town ever had a name. One of them, an elderly widow named Martha Sonia, wept when Odessa showed her the survey map, saying she'd played as a girl by that same well and had always wondered, quietly, why the Freeman name had simply stopped appearing in the town's records somewhere around her 10th birthday, as if a family that large had simply walked into the river and vanished. Clara Freeman Boyd arrived in Larkspur Hollow on a cold morning in November, carrying her grandfather's cavalry discharge papers and a photograph worn soft at the edges, and stood beside Odessa at a public meeting called in the church hall, the only building in town large enough and neutral enough for what needed to happen. Odessa did not stand up to punish anyone. She stood up because a dead clerk had trusted a locked trunk to whoever was patient enough to find it, and she had decided she would not let that trust go to waste out of fear of one loud man. She laid the documents on the table plainly, in the order they told the truth: Isaiah Freeman's original registered claim, the falsified abandonment filing bearing Josiah Calloway's signature, and Tobias Ferris's own letter admitting his part in it and asking forgiveness he never lived to receive. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room did that work for her, the way a room full of people does when they realize the ground beneath their own homes was never quite theirs to begin with. Warwick tried to call the papers forgeries, tried to call Odessa unstable, tried every tool he'd used before, but a territorial land surveyor confirmed the map's authenticity within the month, and the old freighter and 2 neighbors swore before the county clerk to what they'd seen with their own eyes as children. It did not happen overnight, and it did not happen without cost. Warwick lost the house built on ground that was never legally his, lost his seat on the town council, lost the whiskey-fueled goodwill that had shielded him for years, not through any punishment Odessa sought, but simply because the truth, once it stood in daylight, could not be unseen. Odessa did not take the land for herself, though the law would have allowed her a claim as the one who'd uncovered it. She helped Clara Freeman Boyd file to restore her family's original acreage, and used what remained of Tobias Ferris's estate, along with money she earned rebuilding the livery, into a proper stable and forge, to help rebuild the old schoolhouse Isaiah Freeman had first built with his own hands, the one that had quietly vanished from the town's official history somewhere between one land filing and the next. She hired the old freighter's grandson as her first apprentice, and within a year had taken on 2 more, including a girl of 15 who reminded her, more than she ever said aloud, of herself at that age, standing beside her father's forge, watching sparks and thinking they looked like the only stars she could reach. She kept Tobias Ferris's name on a small plaque by the livery door because she believed a man who spent his whole life sitting on a guilty secret still deserved to be remembered for finally choosing, however late, to leave the truth behind rather than bury it deeper. Clara Freeman Boyd asked her once whether it troubled her, sharing credit with a man who had, after all, been party to the wrong in the first place. Odessa considered the question for a long moment before answering that a man who spends 30 years afraid of his own signature has already paid a kind of debt most people never bother to pay at all, and that the ledger of a life, like the ledger of a business, ought to be read whole, not just at its worst entry. The schoolhouse reopened the following spring, with Isaiah Freeman's name carved above the door once more, restored to the record where it had always belonged, and Martha Sonia was there on opening day, standing by the old well she remembered from girlhood, telling anyone who'd listen that some things buried don't stay buried if the right person comes looking. Real justice, it turns out, is rarely about punishment at all. It runs more like water finding its way back to its own bed. It doesn't crash or announce itself. It simply moves, patiently, around whatever stands in its way, until the ground remembers what it always was underneath. The loudest current in a town is never the one doing the real work. It's the quiet, steady one beneath the surface that carves the channel everyone else eventually has to follow. They still called her a fool, some of them, even after. Old habits die slow in small towns, but they said it differently now, the way you might describe someone who'd taken a wild chance and turned out, against every expectation, to be right. Odessa Calloway had walked onto that courthouse porch with $14 and nothing else, bought a collapsing barn nobody wanted for $10 because it was the only door left open to her, and found, sealed above the rafters, not a fortune for herself, but a debt 30 years overdue and a chance to finally pay it. She never once described what she did as vengeance. She called it, when Clara Freeman Boyd asked her one evening why she hadn't simply kept the papers quiet and the land for herself, the same thing her father had told her at the forge, all those years before fire had ever tested her. Some things aren't yours to keep, she said. They're only yours to finally set right. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own worth today. Subscribe for the next story, and tell us in the comments where you listened from. What is a time you found value in something others wrote off? Until next time, stay close.